All right, Krystal, what's on your radar?
Well, sometimes, friends, I get accused of being a class reductionist. I'm not. Anyone who denies the horrors of racism is a complete fool. Rich people have been using race to divide and oppress for hundreds of years. But what I do object to is how class has been intentionally erased from our understanding of politics, power, and economy. This project has been so effective that now in America, a person's class status has nearly zero correlation to how they vote or politically identify. That allows our two main parties to ignore class concerns like economics and labor rights, favoring instead minor sectarian skirmishes that pit different cultural subgroups one against another. Jacobin's Matt Karp has done great research on this front, noting that the mass inequality of America's first Gilded Age thrived on identity-based partisanship, helping extinguish the fires of class rage. In 2021, we are headed down the same path. Now, while classes may be de-aligned at the political level, new research shows that they are highly aligned in other ways, namely that lower socioeconomic classes often get treated in the same terrible and biased manner. A new study conducted by Yale University researchers found that job seekers are judged by their class in mere seconds, and those who are assumed lower status are less likely to be hired and more likely to be low paid, regardless of what their resume says. The researchers looked at 5 different studies in order to make this determination. One found that people could fairly accurately discern class status after hearing just 7 words of that person's speech. Another found that interviewers would assign people with lower socioeconomic status, lower salaries, and bonuses and see them as less of a good fit for a position before even reading about their qualifications or experience. That all just simply based on the way that they talk. Michael Kraus, assistant professor of organizational behavior at the Yale School of Management, explained, "We rarely talk explicitly about social class, and yet people with hiring experience infer competence and fitness based on socioeconomic position estimated from a few seconds of an applicant's speech. Despite what these hiring tendencies might suggest, talent is not found solely among those born to rich or well-educated families." So, why do we talk so little about class when its influence pervades everything from school to religion to work to family? Well, we can rule out one reason. It's not because class politics are unpopular. In fact, another new study shows that if you have to pick between a class framing and a race framing in order to build support for a particular policy, the class framing is significantly more politically effective. So this research shows that, despite leftward shifts in public attitudes towards issues of racial equality, racial framing decreases support for race-neutral progressive policies. Generally, the class frame most successfully increases support for progressive policies across racial and political subgroups. Furthermore, the class framing enjoyed equal support to the race framing even among racial minority groups, but there was a significant backlash among Republicans to the race framing. Now, this makes sense if you think about it, not because racism isn't real and only class is real, but exactly because racism is real. If you want to build support for a social program, you got to convince some racist white people that this isn't just another program for imaginary welfare queens to get their kids new sneakers. Used to be that Republicans would aggressively go out of their way to racialize policies. Welfare was really government handouts for lazy black people. Obamacare was really government handouts for lazy black people. Obama phones, which weren't even an actual thing, were really government handouts for lazy black people. You get the idea. Now, since racism is real and plenty of people hold both subtle and unsubtle racist views, this crap really worked to undermine support for social welfare policies. Now, we covered here recently how the black-white wage gap is just as large as it was back in 1950 under the Truman administration. Just think about that. Now, it has not remained static over that time, though. The black-white wage gap closed significantly during the 60s in particular. That was driven in part by civil rights legislation. But actually, the more significant gains came from increasing rates of unionization, lots of solid blue-collar jobs, and most significantly, a change to minimum wage law that made sure its provisions applied to all professions, the historically black professions, which had originally been left out. Now, all of those gains have been reversed, though, since the 80s. The Southern Strategy, Reaganomics, and all of Republicans' highly successful efforts to attack the New Deal, in part, again, by racializing the social safety net. Reagan would famously spin elaborate tales about welfare queens and strapping young bucks buying T-bone steaks. But now it seems to be Democrats who lean into framing every single issue as racial in nature. Housing, climate, drug legalization, zoning, everything. And look, they're not wrong that virtually every public policy disproportionately impacts Black people because they are disproportionately at the bottom of the income spectrum where government policy can make or break you. But if you actually care about winning support for progressive policies, rather than just virtue signaling about them, research has consistently shown that class framing helps to win the broadest support exactly because race is still such a potent issue. In fact, I would submit that the fact that class solidarity wins support for progressive policies is exactly the reason why you so seldom see it employed. Because there is nothing more dangerous to the holders of power, be they Black, white, or anything else, than actual class politics, when the dividing lines are sectarian and split down the middle between different cultural factions. The plutocrats de facto control both parties. When the dividing lines are between the 1% and the 99%, then capital is in big trouble. The original rural populace of the late 1800s, they knew that. FDR, while certainly imperfect, knew that as well. Fred Hampton knew that. Martin Luther King Jr. knew that. And now risers know it too. Sagar, some of this research really interesting. The political part,
it's fascinating.
Very interesting. And I thought that study about speech patterns was fascinating. And part of what they did is some of the interviewers would read a transcript of what these potential job applicants had to say about. They were just talking about their life story. And some of them listened to the audio. The ones who had the transcript, they couldn't judge the socioeconomic class, and so there wasn't a class penalty. The ones who heard even just 7 words of that, they could nail right away.
That's so nuts.
The socioeconomic class. So it just shows you how this pervades absolutely everything and gets so little attention.
Of course, and this is why you don't see people of lower socioeconomic status in most elite professions, even though it's like you said. I mean,
or elite colleges.
Doesn't
for that
Cornel
matter.
West famous it's like diverse faces and high places. He's right. I mean, look, I went to Georgetown and all that. It was very diverse in there. Basically, everyone had the same socioeconomic background. Like in terms of upward class mobility, it's almost non-existent in America today, especially in the highest, most important elite spaces. Which is why the diversity obsession and more in those places drives me crazy. What is the number one engine of upward mobile growth in America? It is community colleges. Do you know what the college which has lifted more people out of low class, poor class to upper middle class? It's the City College of New York system.
Yeah.
And yet nobody talks about it. Like how many times have you heard about that instead of like increasing quotas or whatever at Harvard or Yale? That is more about fighting over the scraps, or not even the scraps, the majority of the pie up at the top, than really focusing on and trying to figure out what are ways to live in a more harmonious society. And actually, your point is very important, which is that if you focus things on class, you actually can solve race problems too. So it's not denying problems of racism. It is actually trying to fix them if this is something that you want to do politically. And look, we said this before, which is that if you want to talk more about it, if you want to turn everything into racialized politics, do you really want to return to the age of white identitarian voting? Because I certainly don't. I got to miss out on that when my parents immigrated to America. And frankly, we're beginning to see more of a rise of it, specifically because of rhetoric and policies and more, which are being pushed this way. I don't want to come anywhere near that, and I don't think any of you should either. And part of the reason that it is on the rise is specifically as every action has an equal and opposite reaction. That is the biggest problem that we see. And I'm glad that you highlighted this because it's very important to small p political success. Do you want to be good at politics? Politics is the art of convincing people, even some people who you disagree with, in order to support your policy. This is how you do it.
Yeah, and so, I think it's really interesting because it gets to a kind of foundational difference that I think I have with a lot of liberals and even a number of leftists as well, which is that the left has been so irrelevant for so long that it's become more about like personally signaling that you're in the right place. Yeah. Theoretical ideological discussions rather than an actual project to build power. So the Bernie Sanders campaign was the first in in a long time where you actually had a genuine, legitimate effort to build some sort of power. And those efforts are extraordinarily nascent and they're extraordinarily tenuous. So you have a lot of people who aren't really focused on the pragmatic work of, okay, here's what we want to accomplish. Now let's figure out the best path forward to do this. So like I said, it's not that they're wrong in saying, look, things like housing, things like zoning, things like climate change, like all these issues 100% have a racial aspect to them because Black and brown people are disproportionately at the bottom of the income spectrum. Everything the government does has a disproportionate racial impact. But you have to ask yourself, what is the best way to actually accomplish and effectuate these policies that are going to disproportionately benefit Black and brown people? And the instinct in the Democratic Party and on the left has increasingly been, and I would say that Joe Biden is kind of a dissenter from this, which
I think that's why he won.
Part of why he won, part of why he's been effective. But the instinct to frame every single issue in that lens, well, it makes it seem, again, because people aren't as racially evolved as we maybe want them to, because race still is such a potent issue, it's not as effective of a way to ultimately build support. So I think this is just like about pragmatic power building politics, but it's also about the fact that class is it's intentionally invisibilized in the country. That discussion is intentionally erased because it's extraordinarily challenging to people in power. Goldman Sachs has no problem hiring a few elite, diverse faces or women, whatever, to put at the top of their spectrum. They're still going to do the same shitty stuff that destroys the country and makes life harder, especially for Black and brown people. So when you talk about the class narrative, it is a lot more challenging to institutions of power, which is exactly why it's invisibilized.
Yeah, as you were talking, it reminded me of this. Goldman Sachs says they will pledge $10 billion in investment capital and $100 million in philanthropic capital to impact the lives of 1 million Black women. Okay, I think that's good. What is that really? It's a press release to say, please don't tax me slightly more so we can improve the lives of I don't know how many Black women are in this country, but as far as I know, if you want to look at the people who are earning minimum wage, I believe actually Black women are disproportionate amongst the number of people who rely on it as their sole wage, not like in terms of at the lower end of their age. I'm talking like 40 or 50-year-old people. You got to see through this stuff.
Well, think about the miner strike that I covered yesterday. They've got in their corporate social. This mining company is now owned by private equity barons. They've got their fancy corporate social responsibility report where they talk about their diversity initiatives, et cetera. Meanwhile, the workers have had to go on strike just to get back the pay cut that they took in 2016 to rescue. And by the way, a significant number, something like 30 or 40% of the workforce is Black. Okay, so you're gonna have an inclusive hiring, but that's great. But then how are you actually treating people? What does it look like for the workforce on the ground? That part they never get to.
I mean, Amazon says Black Lives Matter. Of the 500,000 people that they hired this year, how many do you think are Black? Like a huge portion of them.
Yeah.
And what are they being paid? How are they being treated? You don't hear that part of the discussion.
Next on Rising, Jennifer Holdsworth-Karp and Rachel Bovard are with us for Team Rising after this.